In creating this database, you've had to make some decisions about what to include, what not to include. So let's start by talking about how the K through 12 school shooting database defines a school shooting.
Yeah, that was one of the most kind of complicated issues to figure out at the start of this project is what is a school shooting and what is a mass shooting, because those are actually just colloquial terms. They're not grounded in any federal policy. They're not codified anywhere in law. It's just what people hear and what's on the news or what's commonly, cited. But really, a school shooting can mean different things to different people and different communities.
Right.
So a planned attack like Uvalde is something that we think of as a school shooting. But if you're at a school in downtown Chicago and somebody starts firing in the hallway and multiple bystander students are wounded, that also is a school shooting for that community, even though a lot of research would discount that because it wasn't necessarily a planned attack, because maybe somebody involved had gang affiliations. Maybe it was related to a drug dispute. So what I found is that a lot of parameters are put up around different definitions of school shootings, and they exclude things that may be important in different marginalized or different socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. So by just pulling back any of those possible exclusion criteria, decided to define this as any time a gun is fired on school property. And so that removes any possible biases. And then the data is coded with as many variables as possible so that a researcher can then filter it for whatever their question is. So the thought here is gather as much information that really shows the systemic gun violence on school campuses, and then from there, enable other researchers to filter it for whatever their specific questions are.
And I think that in making those decisions, I think that it seems like you almost put a parent lens on what to include, because I think I know from my listeners and from the other parents that I've worked with, they would want to know about any time a school is fired on school property. You're absolutely right. But of course, this also creates other problems about response and threat assessment, as you mentioned. So one of the big distinctions in your data is between an active shooter and all shooters. What's the difference between an active shooter and all shooters?
And again, that's a term where, even though it's commonly used within the government, since it was created around 2008, it's not a term that has a common definition across different agencies, and then it's not even really understood in the same way across the public. But the thought there is that an active shooter is somebody who is trying to kill multiple random people in multiple places. That can break down because, say, somebody went into one classroom and killed a bunch of people in that one classroom. They've never technically been in multiple places. So would that be or would that not be an active shooter?
Right.
That's where anytime you assign these definitions, there are so many nuances within the circumstances that make that definition a boundary that becomes exclusionary rather than something that's allowing you to kind of capture the full picture of gun violence in schools. So just kind of getting back to it in the spirit of what we commonly think of as kind of that rampage attack school shooting, the ones labeled as an active shooter are right. That, somebody just really trying to kill people.
And as you mentioned, and this is, reading directly, off of the database, that this could be an altercation at a school sporting event that happens in a parking lot late at night between adults, but a gun goes off, and that would be a school shooting on your database, but not an active shooter event because this was an escalation of an argument. Am I saying that correctly?
Exactly. And that's the, I think, important distinction to make, and why it was so important to capture all of this data is because the majority of incidents that happen were not pre-planned. Somebody happened to have a gun, and when some circumstances turned into a dispute, then they, ended up firing the weapon. People were injured, sometimes their target, oftentimes bystanders, and then that person almost always flees the scene immediately. And that is very different from somebody who's committing a planned attack. But in terms of school security planning, we really only have one piece in the toolbox, and that's lock the school down. And locking a school down, usually for multiple hours, having students hide under desks or in closets or in bathrooms, is not the correct response if there was an argument in the hallway, somebody fired shots and then ran immediately. Because in that situation, there's no longer a threat at the school. There was only one person ever targeted, and a 5-hour lockdown is going to create incredible trauma and stress for every student who heard those shots and now thinks somebody's coming to their classroom to get them. And for every parent who now is rushing to leave work because they got text messages from their kids, they're seeing on social media, the large police response, plainclothes officers with weapons. Now people are getting reports of multiple shooters. What we can't do without really widely inclusive data is understand the different types of situations that are happening and how our response needs to be different for those situations. If we only look at Uvalde's, we miss the thousands of others. And if we're not paying attention to those thousands of other isolated incidents, then we're never creating plans and we're never creating training around how we respond differently to them.
Well, I really appreciate how you stated that. And I also appreciate your history of looking at this from a threat assessment perspective. So you've been living with this data for a while now. And again, I encourage all my listeners to go to the K through 12 school shooting database and look at some of these numbers themselves. But what are your interpretations of the school shooting data trends?
One of the things that surprised me most about this project, and being somebody who was in 8th grade when the Columbine shooting happened, is thinking that Columbine was the starting point. But this data is 1970 to present, and there have been planned attacks at schools every year back to 1970. So just yesterday was the 25th anniversary of the Thurston High shooting in Oregon. And that was a student, this is the year before Columbine, a student who had been expelled, which is a very important thing about how we think about school discipline. So this 15-year-old student who had been expelled came back to the campus during lunch. He was wearing a black trench coat, and he pulled a rifle and a pistol out of his trench coat in the cafeteria, and he shot 27 people there. 2 died. And a difference between the modern kind of school shootings, the school shootings of the last 10 years, and the school shootings of the prior 40, is that more people were wounded rather than killed, because the high-power semi-automatic AR-15 rifle is a distinct difference in the school shootings of the last few years. So in this shooting 25 years ago, he had a small caliber pistol and a small caliber rifle. Very traumatic situation. I mean, 27 people being shot in the school cafeteria, serious situation. Fortunately, 2 people died, where today that number would probably be completely different. But what's important is by looking at this broader historical context, you can see that the same types of things were happening when there were very different social variables. And that lets us cut through a lot of the noise. Because if a planned attack happened 25 years ago, that was before social media, before internet, before smartphones. So are those root causes or those ancillary factors? And
Right.
once you see the historical context, it lets you realize that, okay, social media is not necessarily the driver of this because we have 30 years of attacks before social media. We can look at a common cause in that scenario and see this was a student with disciplinary issues who was expelled from the school. Well, once you expel somebody from the school, you're removing them from that school community. You're removing them from all the resources that would either be able to detect that they're getting closer to committing violence or be able to help them through that crisis. So exclusionary discipline is something that occurs before many planned attacks. The school wants to get somebody out, but that doesn't stop somebody from coming back. And, if you look at Thurston High in 1998, well, 20 years later, 2018 in Parkland, you have an expelled student come back to the school and commit a mass attack. So I think that one of the really powerful things in this data is understanding the root causes that have occurred across a 50-year period, because that lets us remove a lot of the noise that's a distraction.
Right. No, I think so. There's so much in what you just said there, and my listeners, if they've been listening, they will have heard Professor Aaron Kupchak talk about exclusionary school discipline and how harmful it can be, and this is a measure that he didn't even bring up at the time. The other thing that when you look at the data on your site, we also see a difference between shootings that are happening within a school and shootings that are happening around the school. Can you break that down a little bit? What percentage of shootings happen within a building versus kind of outside in the parking lots, on the school fields?
The common conception of a school shooting is somebody entering a classroom and shooting at students inside the classroom. But that's actually a pretty rare scenario in terms of both planned attacks and overall gun violence on school property. So across the 50 years, only about a third of the shootings occur inside the school building. Most of them occur in the parking lots or the area surrounding the building. And that's actually increased in the last couple of years, because when you think about it, as a school adds fortification, adds things like metal detectors, somebody who wants to shoot someone is going to do that just beyond the metal detectors. You still have a campus where people are congregating in front of the building, in the parking lots. And it also fits with one of the things I track is the time period within the school day when shootings occur. And most shootings occur during transition periods, when students are arriving in the morning, changing classes, lunchtime, or after school. And that's when people are mixing, people are in common areas. And if there is a conflict, or if somebody wants to target a large number of students, doing so when they're moving throughout the school in common areas is the easiest time for that to occur.
That's so interesting, again, because all of this, kind of speaks to the kind of policies that we might put in place if we really cared about preventing these kind of incidents. And I've got another question for you, and I think that you can see that I'm starting to build towards an argument maybe, or a question later on. You also track the type of school, so how many shootings occur in elementary schools versus middle schools versus high schools. So what percentage of these shootings are happening in elementary schools?
So about 20% of the shootings occur in elementary schools. The majority of the shootings, more than 60%, are in high schools. And that's an important kind of distinction to make in terms of looking at the full picture of gun violence, because proportionally there are more elementary schools than there are high schools. Usually multiple elementary schools feed into middle schools, feed into a high school. So you have a higher concentration of teenage students within a high school. And usually, whether it's a fight or a planned attack, it's students between 12 and 19 years old. The mean is about 15 and a half. But then elementary schools are usually incidents that are not committed by the students in the school, but are things like disputes between parents, disputes in the pickup lines have been growing, domestics. And domestic violence is something that's excluded from a lot of school shooting research. But if there are parents that are having a conflict that is becoming violent, and they've been separated in other places, and there are restraining orders in other places, a common ground where either one parent knows the other one is going to be, or where they may have an arrangement that one drops off and another picks up, that school can be the area where a domestic incident becomes a shooting or becomes a targeted murder. And that's something that's really overlooked in a lot of the school security planning.
Absolutely. I mean, still something that we absolutely care about as parents, as teachers. We want our schools to be free from that kind of violence as well. But to your point, what we're doing is we're doing active shooter drills, right? That is our big response right now. And this is kind of where I wanted to go with this discussion because, from my perspective and working with a lot of different elementary schools, it seems to me that they are, first of all, they are taking on a greater percentage of the burden of solving the school shooting problem than any other sector. We're asking them to solve it. They're the only sector that's really doing anything about it. And what they're doing is active shooter drills with small elementary school children that we hear a lot of information about what it's doing to the kids, the fear that it's causing, how poorly some of these drills are planned. So kids with disabilities, kids that need their insulin, all of these kids get left out of the equation. They're traumatized by it. And we're doing all of this for what turns out, according to your database and your very good research, to be a very small percentage of the actual school shootings. So you have a background in threat assessments. Have you reached any conclusions about what would be more effective practices?
We really need to remember that there's not any empirical evidence behind the current sets of procedures. So after the Columbine shooting, there was a need to change something after you had a delayed response with officers waiting outside while students bled out inside. And that caused a switch within law enforcement to say, we're going to get right into the building and get to people. That was made. There hasn't been a lot of study into exactly how effective that is. But in general, you want to get to an assailant as quickly as possible. On the occupant side, now the convention is shelter somewhere and law enforcement is going to come to you. That's what's taught to students in a school. Stay in your classroom, get under your desk, lock the door. Police will be there to get you as quickly as possible. That is different guidance than we give people, including children, in every other public space. If you're at a shopping mall, a movie theater, an airport, a train station, a public square, or a restaurant, we tell you if you hear gunshots, run. Run away is the first thing to do. And we've decided in a school that run is not going to be the guidance. The classroom in Uvalde, if students had run from the classroom rather than sheltered in the classroom, there would have very likely been fewer fatalities there. In Serbia, 2 weeks ago, there was a planned attack on a school. A former student came in, and as soon as he walked into the classroom, students started running out of the back of the classroom. There was the second exit. And that student had Molotov cocktails, where he was planning to shoot and then detonate flammable explosives in the school. We have to remember most school shootings are not planned as just a shooting. Yet the blanket guidance is to lock yourself inside a classroom. Many schools are adding fortifications to doors, extra locks to doors, doors that young children or students in wheelchairs or students with access and functional needs are not able to open themselves. And we're doing that in scenarios that often involve plans to light flammable liquids or detonate explosives.
I want to point out, and this is with the caveat. I mean, I think, David, you and I agree. I mean, you're in this, I'm in this, because we want safe, happy, healthy schools for all kids. And any number of victims is too many. I think that you and I would both agree to that. But even when we look at a spike on one of your charts, like you have relatively complete data for 2022, and there were 303 school shooting incidents in that year. Right? There are nearly 135,000 schools. So 303 incidents at 135,000 schools in the U.S. So these incidents are rare, thankfully rare, even though they're going up. As we've just discussed, we've seen that if you start to look at those things that we are most afraid of, that active shooter in a school, that 303, that number starts to dwindle down and get lower and lower and lower. So to your point, the thing that we're practicing doesn't even necessarily work for that thing that's incredibly, incredibly rare. So how would you've put so much effort into this, very excellent resource. How would you like to see the K through 12 school shooting database used in the future?
Yeah, I hope that anytime somebody is thinking about making a purchase of technology or security equipment for a school system, that they take a look at 2,300 incidents from the last 50 years and mark off how many of those incidents that technology would actually stop, and then how many of those incidents that investment or change might actually make it even worse. And same with lockdown procedures, drills. Say, how many of these incidents line up with our drill? How many times would an incident happen that actually might make our drill into the wrong action to take? So if we have a shooting in a hallway during lunch and we're practicing for a shooting in a classroom every time, do students know what to do when that shooting happens in the cafeteria during lunch? If we're adding safe rooms to classrooms, that's an extraordinarily expensive investment, but some school districts are making it. That safe room applies to one scenario, one very specific scenario where all of the students are ready inside the classroom and able to get into that really quickly. What happens during lunch when all of those students are in the cafeteria? Do they all run back to their individual classrooms? Or do you end up with 300 students in the closest classroom and only 20 of them can get into the safe room? Those are the types of things to think about when you have this broader context. So you can look at 2,300 incidents and say, how many line up with what we're planning for? How many line up with what we're training for? And how many line up with the purchase we're about to make?